So there's a talk I was going to give before the COVID-19 lockdown. There's a talk I'd like to give, which is an epic tale of change and hope. And there's a talk I think I need to give, which is very specific to this time and place we find ourselves in now. So let me start by telling you this is not a Zoom background. These are real trees, this is a real sky, and I'm in a real place somewhere called Abbey Fields in Colchester in Essex. And I'll tell you a little bit more later why I chose to be here, because it's an important part of what I want to share with you today. So about 9 months ago, I was invited to take part in TEDxColchester, and I was very excited by that. I'd spent 10 years doing research into how the world was changing and why the world was changing. Research that took me all the way around the world, and I presented it into a book, and particularly about what we could do as human beings to thrive in this emerging new world that we find ourselves in. And that's kind of why I was invited to talk at the event, and I was excited about that. And then, of course, COVID-19 came along. The event was meant to be in April 2020, and understandably and quite rightly, it was cancelled. And then about a month ago, the organisers came back to me and said, why don't we actually do them online? Why don't we record the talks we were going to give and we can present them in a different way? And I was excited about that, and I started to prepare and I started to practice. Now, I've done a lot of speaking in my time, and I found that, that this new thing I was trying to do was kind of difficult. I found it difficult to concentrate, and particularly I began to realise how tired I was. As I started to confront that, I realised it wasn't particularly about preparing for giving a talk, just how generally tired and exhausted I was finding myself, and I was kind of hacking through every day. And I started to talk to my friends, and they were kind of reporting the same thing, and very quickly I realised just collectively we're exhausted. I started to wonder about that. And then I took my first major trip. You know, I'm down here in Essex and I'm from Yorkshire up north, so I hired a car and I drove up there, and I found the whole thing kind of overwhelming and difficult. And at first I thought, well, it's just because I haven't done it for a while, but really when I thought about it, I thought I shouldn't be this tired. So that's really what I want to talk to you about today, which is why are we so tired all the time? And more crucially, what can we do about it? And so it goes back to some of the research I was doing into neuroscience and how our brains work. And if you look at the history of neuroscience, it goes right back to Stone Age man. Stone Age man performed this procedure which was called trepanation. People that must have been experiencing some kind of mental illness, they would punch a hole in their skull using a piece of flint, which seems pretty crude by today's standards. But if you look at fossil remains, it looks like a number of those people lived for quite a long period of time after that, which suggests it might have been successful. But it wasn't until about 2,500 years ago that we really started to get into it, and a Greek philosopher called Hippocrates came along, and his suggestion, which today doesn't seem that radical, was that we did our thinking in our brain. Before that, we'd assumed that the thinking went on in our bodies, which is kind of interesting because that is coming around again now that we've actually started to understand a little bit more how the body works. The new kind of research is suggesting that we do thinking in our brain, but also there is stuff going on in our body too, which points to unconscious kind of activity, which is crucial, I think, to what I want to talk to about you today. So that's the way we thought, and for the next 2,500 years, the assumption from man was that we had this brain, and in the brain, thinking happened. The Victorians particularly got very interested in this, and they started to take dead bodies and take them apart and pull out the brain and cut them up and put them in formaldehyde. And if you go to any Victorian medical museum, you'll probably see a brain in a jar. But in the 1970s, we started to see things a bit differently. Digital electronics had come along. We were able to kind of look at brain activity and electrical activity in the brain on a far more granular level. And what neuroscientists began to realize was that the brain wasn't this fixed object. It was changing and is reconfiguring itself all the time. Something that got called neuroplasticity. And a phrase that emerged during that time was that neurons that fire together wire together. So in other words, as we started to think about things and we started to take action about what we were thinking about, those neurons began to kind of form bundles. And we began to realize that's kind of how habits formed. At the same time, though, some research that was done in the University of California pointed to something very interesting, which even today, most of us haven't really kind of got our heads around. What scientists in the University of California in San Francisco did was they started to try and record the time lag between when we had a thought to do something and when we actually did it. And what they found was quite disturbing. what they found in the majority of cases was that the neuron that fires to do something happens before we think about it. Now that's one of those things you just need to think about a bit, because using our brain, this brain's what? So in other words, the neurons that fire for an action happen before our thought. Now what this pointed to is that our idea of free will and our idea that we're actually doing things consciously isn't actually correct. It was so radical that for about 20 years it kind of got put on the edge of science, but again in 2007 scientists in the Max Planck Institute in Germany did a similar but more detailed experiment and categorically proved this to be the fact. So what this is pointing to, and why it's crucial to why we're tired all the time, is an awful lot of what we do is unconscious. An awful lot of what we do is habitual, and that's the crucial thing that I realized. What's happened over the last few months is that all our habits, all our unconscious processes that we've developed over years and years over the course of our life have been disrupted. So if you look at what happened to me, I had my work and I used to get on a train and I'd drive different places. I'd get up in the morning and I'd quite often have a ritual where I would go outside. I'd do yoga classes. I'd do other classes. There's different places I went. I had a whole series of things I did that suddenly I couldn't do. No wonder I'm so tired, because what I'm now having to do is be conscious of everything I'm doing. 85 to 90% of what I was doing beforehand was a series of habits that I was just triggering, and suddenly I'm having to think about things. Now that was hard enough in the lockdown, but at least I was in the constraints of my house and at least the rules were kind of clear. But now as we've moved out of the lockdown, where the rules are a lot more open to interpretation, suddenly the world seems like a really dangerous place. So my trip up north is a really good example. Once upon a time I would have got in the car and I'd have driven and I would have been listening to the radio, and when I drove into a service station, even though I was conscious of what I was driving, there's a lot of things I didn't need to think about. I would get out, I would get the petrol pump out, I'd put it in the car, I wouldn't actually be having to think much about that. I'd walk into the filling station, I'd join the queue, I'd pay. But suddenly the world seems dangerous and I'm having to think about it. Should I do this? And should I touch this? And should I do this? I'm having to think all the time. So what's happened to most of us is suddenly we've moved from a period where 80-90% of what we're doing is habitual, we're not having to think about it, to pretty much everything we're having to do, we're having to think all the time and negotiate. We're not triggering those patterns. So we're actually fighting against the wiring in our brain. This explains why a number of people, I think, have wanted to rush back suddenly to go to McDonald's or coffee shops. I was really surprised when the lockdown ended that around the corner from where I am there's a drive-through Costa and there's this huge long queue. And I'm like, why would people drive and queue for like hours to get a paper cup of coffee or tea, something they probably have learned to make at home, which they can't go into the cafe to sit in a car park or in the back of the car? Why is that? And it's a pull to the familiar. It was a pull to the habitual. So what we're having to do is broker all the time, which is why we're so tired. So what's the solution to this? Well, it's three things. And it's why I've decided to do this outside. We spend a lot of time in our rooms, in our offices, particularly if you've kept working, on Zoom at your desk. So the first thing is to do is to go outside. Get outside, get into the great outdoors and allow your brain to expand, allow yourself to be in places that are safe and feel safe, because only when you're in a safe places you can let your guard down, you're not having to worry all the time. The second thing is to give yourself a break. Give yourself a break emotionally, but quite literally give yourself a break. One of the things we've tried to do is we've tried to port what we were doing beforehand into this new paradigm we find ourselves in. We're trying to run hour-long meetings that we used to run as an hour-long meeting online, and that's just dumb. We need to give ourselves more time. We need to give ourselves more space. We need to be more concentrated in what we're doing. We need to recognize how difficult it is. But the reason I share about this is because the big opportunity here is we were in a world that a lot of us realized was working in a way that we weren't very happy about. A lot of us saw this as an opportunity for change. And what's happened is all our habits have been broken. Now there's a pull to go back to how things were. I keep hearing now, we need to get back, we need to get back, we need to get back. But the great opportunity now is we can create new habits, because breaking habits is the hardest thing. It's why it's so difficult to lose weight, to get fit, to stop smoking, to change your diet, whatever it is. We've broken those habits. So if we really do want to create a world that works in a different way, a world that we're happy to be in, collectively and individually, we have the opportunity to create new habits. And that's an idea I think is worth sharing.